Welcome to Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving deep into one of history's most enduring mysteries, the true identity of Jack the Ripper. For over 130 years, this case has captivated the world, spawning countless theories, investigations, and suspects. But what makes this case so fascinating isn't just the brutality of the crimes. It's the sheer number of potential culprits that emerge from the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London. Picture this. It's 1888, and the gas-lit alleys of Whitechapel are about to become the stage for terror. In the space of just a few months, a killer would emerge from the shadows, commit unspeakable acts, and then vanish without a trace. But here's what's truly remarkable. In the decades that followed, investigators, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists would propose suspects ranging from Polish immigrants to royal physicians, from mad butchers to female midwives, and even to famous artists. Today, we're going to examine the most compelling theories about who Jack the Ripper really was. Some of these suspects were investigated by the actual Victorian police. Others emerged from modern forensic analysis. And some are so bizarre, they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about this case. Fascinated by the chilling minds and hidden motives behind history's most infamous serial killers? Dive into Serial Killer Files on Skoob, the AI-powered podcast platform that brings you a gripping deep dive into the world's most notorious criminals. From Jack the Ripper to Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, Richard Ramirez, and more, each episode uncovers not only the horrific crimes, but also the intricate psychology, investigative breakthroughs, and failures that shape these cases. With tight, immersive episodes filled with unsettling revelations, this series goes beyond true crime storytelling to explore the darkest facets of human nature. Join more than 50,000 true crime enthusiasts who trust Skoob for expertly researched, thought-provoking content. Download Skoob now and subscribe to Serial Killer Files, your ultimate source for true crime, unsolved cases, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Coming back to the Ripper murders, let's start with what the people who actually investigated these crimes believed. And here's where it gets immediately fascinating. Even the top officials couldn't agree. Sir Robert Anderson, the assistant commissioner of the CID during the murders, was absolutely convinced he knew who the killer was. In his autobiography, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, Anderson stated with startling confidence, "In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact." Anderson believed that when their suspect was confined to an asylum, a witness who had seen the murderer immediately identified him. But here's the kicker. When this witness learned the suspect was a fellow Jew, he refused to swear to the identification. This suspect Anderson was referring to was almost certainly Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. Donald Swanson, the chief inspector who led the investigation, later confirmed in his private notes that Kosminski was indeed the suspect Anderson meant. Swanson wrote that Kosminski was sent to Stepney Workhouse, then to Colney Hatch Asylum, and died shortly afterward. But here's where the story gets murky. While Swanson confirmed Kosminski was the suspect, he never actually stated whether he believed Kosminski was guilty, only that he was suspected. Now, if you think the police were united in this theory, think again. Chief Inspector John George Littlechild had a completely different suspect in mind. In 1913, he wrote a private letter to journalist George Sims, revealing that a substantial dossier had been compiled on one Dr. Francis Tumblety, a dubious American character who remained, in Littlechild's words, a very likely suspect. But mysteriously, this file had vanished from Scotland Yard's archives. Most tellingly, Littlechild concluded his letter by saying that Sir Robert Anderson only thought he knew who the killer was, suggesting that nobody actively engaged on the case actually knew with any certainty who Jack the Ripper really was. Then there's Assistant Chief Commissioner Sir Melville Macnaghten, who didn't even arrive at the Metropolitan Police until June 1889, after the murders had ended. Despite this, he familiarized himself with the case details and identified 3 likely suspects: Montague John Druitt, Michael Ostrog, and our friend Kosminski. But Macnaghten had his own favorite. He expressed a clear preference for Druitt, a barrister whose body was found in the Thames shortly after the final murder. What's remarkable is that even Inspector Aberline, the man who walked the streets of Whitechapel during the investigation, dismissed Druitt as a credible suspect in 1903, telling a journalist that apart from the timing of finding his body in the Thames, there was no evidence connecting him to the crimes. So here we have the police officials who actually worked the case, and they can't agree on who did it. Anderson is convinced it's Kosminski. Littlechild favors Tumblety. Macnaghten prefers Druitt, and Aberline thinks they're all wrong. This disagreement among the investigators themselves tells us something crucial about this case. If the people with access to all the evidence couldn't solve it, what hope do we have more than a century later? One thing that fascinated investigators from the very beginning was the apparent medical knowledge displayed by the killer. The mutilations suggested someone with anatomical understanding, leading naturally to theories about medical professionals. But the reality is far more complex and disturbing than you might expect. Let's start with Dr. Francis Tumblety, that American charlatan who caught Chief Inspector Littlechild's attention. Tumblety was a fascinating character, a self-proclaimed doctor with a history of controversy that reads like a Victorian thriller. He'd been accused of involvement in plots related to Abraham Lincoln's assassination and had connections to Irish Fenian nationalist activities. But what made him particularly interesting to investigators was his profound hatred of women. Littlechild described Tumblety's feelings against women as remarkable and bitter in the extreme. This wasn't just casual misogyny. This was something deeper and more pathological. When Tumblety was arrested in November 1888 for gross indecency involving several men, he skipped bail and fled Britain, eventually returning to America under the assumed name Frank Townsend. Here's where it gets really intriguing. Some speculate that Tumblety might have been involved in similar Ripper-like murders in the United States between 1891 and 1892. Could Jack the Ripper have simply moved his operations across the Atlantic? It's a tantalizing possibility, though there's a significant problem with the Tumblety theory. Homosexual serial killers typically target men, not women. Plus, he may have been in police custody on November 9, 1888, when Mary Kelly was murdered. But medical knowledge didn't necessarily mean a doctor. Consider the case of Severin Klosowski, better known as George Chapman. Inspector Aberline was so convinced Chapman was Jack the Ripper that when Chapman was arrested for poisoning his wives, Aberline reportedly told his fellow Inspector Godley, "At last you have captured Jack the Ripper." Chapman's background seemed to fit perfectly. He had medical and surgical training in Russia, arriving in England in 1888, right when the murders began. When he left for America, the London murders stopped, and similar killings occurred after his arrival there. The timing was almost too perfect. But here's what bothered critics. Chapman's known method was poisoning, not knife attacks. Serial killers rarely change their modus operandi so dramatically. Aberline wasn't bothered by this inconsistency, arguing that a man capable of watching his wives die slowly from poison could certainly be capable of other heinous acts. He also pointed out that Chapman had attempted to murder his first wife in New Jersey with a knife, showing he was willing to use different methods. There was one major issue with Chapman as a suspect. He was only 23 years old during the murders, significantly younger than witness descriptions. But Aberline dismissed this, noting that the witnesses claimed to have seen only the suspect's back, which could easily lead to misjudgment of age. The medical knowledge angle becomes even more intriguing when we consider the possibility that the Ripper might not have been a traditional doctor at all, but someone with practical anatomical experience gained through a very different profession. This leads us to one of the most compelling suspect categories: those who worked with death and dismemberment as part of their daily lives. Sometimes the most obvious answer is hiding in plain sight. If you're looking for someone comfortable with blood, skilled with knives, and familiar with anatomy, where would you look? The slaughterhouses and butcher shops of Victorian London, of course. Enter Jacob Levy, a Jewish butcher who lived right in the heart of the Ripper's killing grounds. Modern criminal profiling tells us that serial killers typically begin their crimes close to home, and Levy's story fits this pattern perfectly. He lived with his wife and 2 children on Middlesex Street, just 3 streets away from George Yard, where Martha Tabram was found, and a mere 100 yards from Goulston Street, where part of Catherine Eddowes' bloodied apron was discovered. But Levy wasn't just any butcher. He was a man driven to madness. His interactions with local prostitutes led to him contracting syphilis, which in his case progressed to violent behavior and paranoid delusions. In a diseased mind struggling with these mental ailments, Levy could have convinced himself that murdering women was justified. Think about it from a practical standpoint. Levy's occupation gave him the exact skills needed for the Ripper's gruesome mutilations. He wouldn't have been unnerved by handling human remains, and he might even have kept grisly souvenirs at his workplace. The streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields were full of butchers and slaughtermen during the early morning hours. So Levy, often covered in blood from his work, would have blended in seamlessly. The physical evidence is compelling too. Witness Joseph Lewend described a man about 7.5 centimeters taller than the woman he was with. Catherine Eddowes was 152 centimeters tall, and Jacob Levy was about 160 centimeters, a perfect match. At 32 during the murders, he also fit the age profile. But here's what's truly chilling about the Levy theory: the timeline. By 1890, his mental health had deteriorated so badly that his wife reported his nocturnal restlessness and irrational wanderings. Authorities considered confining him to an asylum, and asylum records noted his feelings of impending violence, auditory hallucinations, inexplicable crying, and involuntary urges born of guilt. Jacob Levy died in the asylum in 1891, and here's the kicker. That's exactly when Scotland Yard decided to close the case files on the Whitechapel murders. But butchers weren't the only ones with relevant skills. Consider the theory of the Shochet, a kosher slaughterman and minor cleric within the Jewish community. A Shochet would have been a respected, educated figure, despite his modest income. His dark clothes and black frock coat would have given him an air of shabby respectability that matched some witness descriptions. The psychological profile here is fascinating. A Shochet was a trusted community figure, exactly the kind of person who could approach vulnerable women without raising suspicion. In the desperate circumstances of London's East End, impoverished women could easily have been convinced to follow a familiar religious figure for the promise of money, food, or shelter. Researcher Odell proposed that the Ripper might have been a psychopath with religious mania, a Shochet who derived distorted religious justification for targeting prostitutes, whom he saw as morally corrupt according to certain biblical interpretations. The theory suggests a man whose outward respectability hid the mind of a sexual sadist, using his professional skills not because of his occupation, but to enhance his gruesome activities. There's even a theory about merchant seamen, and this one has some compelling elements. A merchant seaman in the late 19th century would have worn practical, work-oriented clothing and often appeared unkempt, exactly matching many witness descriptions of a sailor-like demeanor. These men typically remained unmarried and might have frequented areas like Whitechapel for encounters with prostitutes. Here's where it gets interesting. If a seaman contracted a sexually transmitted disease from a prostitute, he might have returned to enact revenge. This could explain why there was no evidence of sexual interaction between Jack the Ripper and his victims. The motive wasn't sexual gratification, but revenge. The timing works too. A seaman working on vessels docking in London would be familiar with the local geography and could have been in London during all the known murder dates. The FBI's profile of the Ripper actually aligns well with characteristics of merchant seamen. Many came from impoverished backgrounds with absent fathers, joining the merchant navy as young as 12. Life at sea hardened them to violence, and the ranks often included individuals evading legal consequences. The cessation of the murders could be explained by the seaman being detained abroad or in a colony, or even by him contracting a fatal sexually transmitted disease. Poetic justice, perhaps, for his alleged crimes. Now we venture into some of the more unconventional theories, and trust me, some of these will challenge everything you think you know about Victorian crime. Let's start with one of the most intriguing possibilities. What if Jack the Ripper was actually Jill the Ripper? The idea of a female perpetrator emerged from the mind of Donald McCormick in 1959, based on a conversation with someone he called Dr. Thomas Dutton, allegedly a mentor to Detective Aberline. While there's no evidence that Aberline actually knew anyone by that name, the theory itself has some surprisingly compelling elements. Think about the practical advantages a female killer would have had. At a time when the entire city of London was on the lookout for a male suspect, a woman could traverse the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected. She would face minimal suspicion and risk of apprehension compared to any man walking those streets after dark. The midwife theory in particular is fascinating. A midwife would have legitimate reasons to be out at odd hours, carrying out her professional duties. She would possess the anatomical knowledge necessary for the mutilations, and most importantly, she would be a trusted figure that vulnerable women would willingly approach. William Stewart, writing in 1939, proposed that the killer might have been a midwife who had been wronged by a woman she'd tried to help, leading to imprisonment and a burning desire for revenge. Stewart suggested that a skilled midwife could have easily rendered victims unconscious using pressure point techniques, especially women who were already under the influence of alcohol. The Mary Kelly case provides the most dramatic scenario for this theory. Kelly was reportedly 3 months pregnant and struggling financially when she died. Stewart theorized that Kelly might have sought out an abortionist, inviting the midwife into her room and disrobing in preparation for the procedure. Instead of receiving help, Kelly was brutally murdered, her body mutilated, and her clothes stolen by the killer. Here's where it gets really interesting. Witness Mrs. Maxwell insisted she saw Kelly alive the morning after her supposed death, wearing familiar garments. Could Mrs. Maxwell have actually seen the midwife disguised in Kelly's clothing? It's a theory that would explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the Kelly murder. Stewart even found a real-life parallel in Mary Piercy, who was tried and executed in October 1890 for the gruesome murders of her lover's wife and child. The precision and circumstances of Piercy's crime showed alarming similarities to the Ripper murders, proving that women were certainly capable of such violence. But let's get even more unusual. Enter Dr. Rosalind Johnston, whose real name was Robert Donston Stevenson. Donston was what we might call today a police buff, someone who gets excitement from engaging with police investigators and providing misleading information. But Donston wasn't just playing games. There was something much darker about him. Donston was an avowed Satanist involved in black magic, and he often hinted that he possessed insider knowledge about the Whitechapel murders. He derived perverse satisfaction from rumors that he himself might be Jack the Ripper. His lifestyle included battles with alcohol and drugs, earning him the nickname Sudden Death. 3 weeks after the last murder, Donston wrote an article for the Pall Mall Gazette suggesting that the motive for the killings was the acquisition of a heart and body fat for use in black magic practices. Was this an attempt to redirect suspicion, or an unconscious admission of guilt? The enthusiastic way he described the mutilations raises serious questions about his involvement. His personal life provides disturbing testimony. His mistress, Mabel Collins, claimed that Donston had confessed to being Jack the Ripper and had shown her physical proof of his crimes. This led Collins to confide in Vittoria Kremers, who shared living space with Donston. Kremers' investigation of his lodgings revealed a small metal box containing several ties stained with what appeared to be dried blood, either macabre trophies or artifacts used in satanic rituals. The famous occultist Aleister Crowley later acquired this black box, asserting it had belonged to Jack the Ripper. But perhaps most telling of all, shortly after the last murder, Donston allegedly renounced his dark dealings and converted to Christianity, dedicating the rest of his life to religious endeavors. This dramatic shift suggests a man grappling with intense internal conflicts and possibly seeking redemption for past crimes. Then there's Walter Richard Sickert, the German-born artist who became entangled in Ripper lore thanks to American crime novelist Patricia Cornwell's investigation in 1993. Sickert was 28 at the time of the murders and had alleged connections to the darker corners of London's East End, where Cornwell claimed he maintained secret studios, as Sickert's art often featured impoverished prostitutes as models, such as in The Camden Town Murder, which bore striking similarities to crime scene photographs of Mary Kelly's murder. However, these paintings were created long after the murders, when such photographs were widely available. Cornwell's theory was based partly on her analysis of letters allegedly written by the Ripper, which displayed deep animosity toward prostitutes. She connected this to Sickert's family history. His paternal grandmother was reportedly a prostitute, and his mother was born out of wedlock. In Victorian society, this heritage might have created deep psychological wounds. Most controversially, Cornwell suggested that Sickert suffered from a penile deformity requiring surgery during adolescence, potentially making him incapable of normal sexual relations. She hoped to prove her theory through DNA analysis of the Ripper letters, but found that preservation techniques had destroyed any viable DNA evidence. Want to unravel the chilling mystery behind history's most elusive serial killers? Download Skoob and discover the subtle clues, suspicious suspects, and unsettling patterns that baffled investigators investigating infamous serial killings. Dive deep into the psychology, theories, and dark atmosphere surrounding infamous figures who redefined what evil is. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to Serial Killer Files for your regular dose of chilling true crime stories. Coming back to the Ripper case, some suspects emerge not from professional backgrounds or family histories, but from the desperate circumstances and psychological pressures of Victorian life itself. These are stories of men whose minds snapped under unbearable pressure, turning them into monsters. William Henry Barry represents one of the most compelling cases of a man whose entire life seemed to lead inevitably toward violence. Barry's early trauma was severe. As a young boy, he witnessed his mother being committed to a mental institution and his father being gruesomely injured by a cart. These events likely created deep psychological fractures that would manifest later in terrifying ways. Contemporary accounts describe Barry as possessing all the hallmarks of a psychopath. He was a habitual liar and thief, plagued by acute paranoia. He constantly carried knives, fearing attack, and even slept with one under his pillow. His distrust and disdain for women was pronounced, possibly worsened after contracting a venereal disease that he believed came from his wife, Ellen Elliot. The psychological profile gets even more disturbing when you consider his occupation. In 1887, Barry worked as a horsemeat butcher in London's East End. This job potentially provided an outlet for his destructive fantasies and perhaps acted as displaced revenge for his father's death. The work would have desensitized him to blood and violence while providing the technical skills needed for the Ripper's mutilations. Barry's behavior after Annie Chapman's murder was described as resembling madness. He couldn't account for his whereabouts during any of the East End murders, and in a puzzling move, he sold his horse and cart in December 1888, just after the last known Ripper murder, and fled London with his wife the following month. The police took Barry seriously enough as a suspect that Scotland Yard dispatched Inspector Aberline himself to Scotland to evaluate the evidence and interrogate Barry in his prison cell. Despite their efforts, Barry remained defiant and refused to confess, even when facing execution. His final act was to taunt the hangman, suggesting he believed that by teasing authorities with the possibility of a confession, he might secure clemency in exchange for admitting to the Whitechapel murders. But perhaps the most heartbreaking story is that of James Maybrick, whose alleged confession exists in what might be the most controversial piece of evidence in the entire Ripper case, a diary that surfaced in 1991 and has divided experts ever since. The diary was supposedly discovered by workers rewiring a Victorian house in Liverpool found under floorboards where it had allegedly remained for over a century. The black leather-bound book contained 63 pages of handwritten entries in an expressive, flowing script, signed at the end as Jack the Ripper. The diary came into the possession of Michael Barrett, a scrap metal dealer who claimed it was given to him by a dying friend named Tony Devereux. Barrett said Devereux had obtained it from the workman who found it, but the authentication process revealed troubling inconsistencies. Devereux's daughter denied any knowledge of her father possessing such a diary, and the new owner of Battlecrease House, where it was allegedly found, also claimed ignorance of the discovery. The diary's author was identified as James Maybrick, a prosperous cotton merchant who owned Battlecrease and was poisoned by his wife Florence in May 1889. Maybrick had never been suspected in the Whitechapel murders before this diary surfaced, making it either an incredible historical discovery or an elaborate hoax. The entries allegedly included references to Maybrick's wife and children, as well as to his wife's lover, a relationship that filled him with growing bitterness. One particularly chilling entry read, "I long for peace of mind, but I sincerely believe that it will not come until I have sought my revenge on the whore and the whore master." Critics pointed out that pages had been torn from the front of the diary, suggesting an attempt to conceal the true owner's identity. They also noted markings indicating the book had originally been a photo album. Supporters argued that a deranged individual might have torn out the pages to erase family memories, and questioned why a hoaxer would use a family diary rather than purchasing a new journal. The Maybrick theory presents a fascinating psychological profile. A successful businessman whose personal life was crumbling, who may have channeled his rage over his wife's infidelity into horrific acts of violence against women, he saw as representing all female betrayal. Whether the diary is authentic or not, it captures something essential about the psychology that might drive someone to become Jack the Ripper. As we've journeyed through these theories, one thing becomes clear. The Jack the Ripper case reveals as much about the investigators and theorists as it does about the killer himself. Each generation has projected its own fears, prejudices, and understanding of criminal behavior onto this Victorian mystery. Modern psychological profiling offers insights that weren't available to Victorian investigators. The FBI profile suggests the Ripper was likely a local resident familiar with the area, possibly living alone or with people who suspected his guilt but protected him. This description could fit several of our suspects, from Jacob Levy to Aaron Kosminski. The geographical profiling is particularly interesting. Almost all the confirmed murders occurred within a small area of Whitechapel, supporting the theory that the killer lived nearby. The progression from Martha Taubram in George Yard to the later victims shows a pattern of someone becoming bolder and more confident, expanding their territory as they evaded capture. What's most striking about reviewing all these suspects is how many of them fit certain aspects of the profile perfectly while failing completely in others. Chapman had medical knowledge and the right timeline, but used a completely different method with his known victims. Levy had the right location, occupation, and psychological deterioration, but may have been too mentally ill by the end to carry out the sophisticated later murders. Tumblety had the misogyny and opportunity, but was possibly in custody during the final murder. The witness descriptions themselves are problematic. Most claim to see only the suspect's back or catch brief glimpses in poor lighting. The ages ranged from young to middle-aged. The clothing descriptions varied, and the physical characteristics were inconsistent. This suggests either multiple perpetrators or, more likely, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony under traumatic circumstances. One of the most fascinating aspects of modern analysis is how it reveals the social dynamics of Victorian London. Sir Robert Anderson's insistence on a Jewish suspect reflects the anti-Semitic attitudes of the time. The reluctance of the Jewish witness to testify against Kosminski shows the complex relationships between immigrant communities and authorities. The focus on foreign or marginalized suspects, Polish Jews, American charlatans, failed barristers, reveals how society looks for outsiders to blame for its darkest impulses. The medical knowledge question has also evolved with modern understanding. While Victorian investigators were impressed by what seemed like surgical precision, modern forensic experts suggest the mutilations might have been made by someone with basic butchering skills rather than medical training. This opens up the suspect pool considerably, supporting theories about butchers, slaughterers, or anyone familiar with animal anatomy. Technology that the Victorians couldn't have imagined, DNA analysis, psychological profiling, geographic information systems, has been applied to the case with mixed results. Patricia Cornwell's attempt to use DNA evidence to implicate Sickert foundered on the degraded state of the evidence and the questionable authenticity of the Ripper letters themselves. Perhaps most importantly, modern understanding of serial killer behavior has both supported and challenged various theories. The idea that Chapman could switch from knife attacks to poisoning is unusual, but not impossible. Some killers do change methods when they feel their established pattern makes them vulnerable to capture. The cessation of the murders remains puzzling, as serial killers typically continue until caught, killed, or incapacitated. No discussion of the Ripper case would be complete without addressing the role of media sensationalism and outright hoaxes that have shaped public perception of these crimes. The Victorian press was just as capable of creating moral panic and spreading misinformation as any modern media outlet. The famous Jack the Ripper letters that gave the killer his nickname have been largely dismissed by experts as hoaxes created by journalists or attention seekers. The Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard that followed helped create the image of a taunting, articulate killer who enjoyed his notoriety. But the writing style, the theatrical tone, and the timing all suggest these were fabrications designed to sell newspapers rather than genuine communications from the murderer. This media manipulation had real consequences for the investigation. Police had to waste time following up on hundreds of false leads generated by copycat letters. The public's expectations of what the killer should sound like were shaped by these fake communications, potentially causing witnesses to dismiss suspects who didn't match the media-created profile. The Maybrick Diary represents perhaps the most sophisticated modern hoax attempt, though some still argue for its authenticity. The diary's emergence in 1991 coincided with renewed public interest in the Ripper case, and the literary quality of the entries suggests someone with considerable knowledge of both the case details and Victorian language patterns. The psychological insights in the diary entries are compelling, but they could just as easily come from a modern understanding of criminal psychology as from a genuine Victorian psychopath. What's particularly telling about the diary controversy is how it reveals our desire for closure. The idea that the case could be definitively solved with a single piece of evidence is seductive, but it ignores the complexity of historical investigation and the unreliability of sensational discoveries. The media's role in creating and perpetuating Ripper theories continues today. Patricia Cornwell's investigation of Sickert was exhaustive and well-funded, involving forensic experts and access to archives, but it ultimately relied on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Her book's title, Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, exemplifies the modern media's desire to provide definitive answers to complex historical mysteries. Similarly, the various television documentaries, books, and articles that promote different suspects often cherry-pick evidence that supports their chosen theory while ignoring contradictory facts. Each new theory is presented as the final solution, only to be challenged by the next investigator with a different suspect in mind. This pattern reveals something important about how we process unsolved mysteries. The human mind craves closure and explanation, especially for crimes that seem random or motiveless. Each generation of investigators brings its own assumptions and methodologies to the case, confident that modern science or psychology can solve what Victorian investigators could not. But perhaps the most honest assessment comes from Chief Inspector Littlechild's 1913 letter, where he suggested that Sir Robert Anderson only thought he knew who the killer was. This admission that even those closest to the investigation had doubts should humble modern theorists who claim certainty about events that occurred more than a century ago. Looking at this rogues gallery of suspects, we can see the social anxieties and prejudices of Victorian England reflected like funhouse mirrors. Each theory tells us not just about a potential killer, but about what society feared most in the dark underbelly of London. The focus on foreign suspects, Kosminski the Polish Jew, Tumblety the American charlatan, Chapman the Russian immigrant, reveals the xenophobic undercurrents of Victorian society. These men were easy targets for suspicion precisely because they were outsiders in a community that was already struggling with rapid immigration and social change. The reluctance of witnesses to testify against members of their own community, as Anderson noted with the Jewish witness who refused to swear against Kosminski, shows how these immigrant communities protected themselves against a system they didn't fully trust. The medical suspects, Tumblety, Chapman, the theoretical doctor killer, reflect Victorian society's complex relationship with the medical profession. While doctors were gaining respect and status, there was still something unsettling about men who cut into human bodies for a living. The Jack the Ripper murders, with their surgical precision and anatomical focus, tapped into deep fears about medical knowledge being used for evil rather than healing. The occupational theories, butchers, slaughterers, sailors, reveal anxieties about the working classes and the violence that seemed to lurk beneath the surface of industrial society. These men worked with death and blood daily, and in the public imagination, it was a short step from slaughtering animals to murdering humans. The fact that such workers could move through the streets covered in blood without arousing suspicion highlighted how normalized violence had become in certain sectors of Victorian life. Perhaps most fascinating are the outsider theories: the female killer, the satanist, the mad artist. These represent fears about the breakdown of social order, about trusted figures revealing monstrous hidden natures. The midwife theory is particularly telling. It transforms a figure associated with bringing life into the world into an agent of death, inverting one of society's most fundamental trust relationships. Dr. Johnston's Satanist angle tapped into Victorian fears about occultism and the corruption of religious faith. His dramatic conversion to Christianity after the murders reflects the era's belief in redemption and the possibility of spiritual transformation, even for the most depraved individuals. Sickert's case shows how artistic bohemianism was viewed with suspicion by respectable society. The idea that an artist might be driven to murder by sexual frustration or family shame reflects Victorian anxieties about the moral dangers of artistic life and unconventional sexuality. The psychological profiles that emerge from these suspects also reveal evolving understanding of mental illness and criminal behavior. Jacob Levy's progression from syphilis to violent madness follows a Victorian medical model that connected physical disease with moral decay. William Henry Barry's childhood trauma and psychopathic behavior prefigures modern understanding of how early abuse can create violent adults. What's particularly striking is how many of these suspects were men whose lives had been derailed by disease, addiction, financial failure, or social rejection. They represent the casualties of Victorian society's rapid transformation. Men who couldn't adapt to changing circumstances and channeled their frustration into violence against the most vulnerable members of society. The focus on prostitutes as victims also reveals Victorian attitudes toward women and sexuality. These were women who had already been marginalized and dehumanized by society, making them easy targets for a killer and less likely to receive intensive police protection. The theories that connect the killer's motivation to sexual disease or moral outrage reflect society's tendency to blame the victims for their own fate. How well can you spot evil when it's disguised as charm? On Skoob, we dive deep into the unsettling truth behind some of history's most deceptive serial killers who use their intelligence and charisma to mask unimaginable horrors. This podcast uncovers the hidden layers to reveal the disturbing realities of serial killers like Jack the Ripper, Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and others who shattered the idea of what evil looks like. Through detailed storytelling and chilling analysis, Skoob brings you face to face with the manipulations, crimes, and cultural aftermath left behind by these infamous figures. Download Skoob now and gain exclusive insight into the minds of those who hid darkness behind a smile. Subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes and the latest true crime explorations. As we reach the end of our journey through the suspects and theories surrounding Jack the Ripper, we're left with a sobering realization. We're probably no closer to identifying the killer today than the Victorian police were in 1888. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The Jack the Ripper case has become something more than a criminal investigation. It's become a mirror that reflects our deepest fears and anxieties about human nature, urban life, and the capacity for evil that lurks within ordinary people. Each generation has found in this case what it was looking for. Victorians saw confirmation of their fears about immigration and moral decay. Mid-20th century investigators focused on psychological dysfunction and sexual pathology. Modern theorists apply forensic science and criminal profiling. What we've learned from examining all these suspects is that the truth is probably simpler and more complex than any single theory suggests. The killer was likely someone who lived or worked in the Whitechapel area, someone familiar enough with the streets and routines to move around undetected. He probably had some experience with violence or anatomy, whether through legitimate work or criminal activity. He may have been mentally ill, though not necessarily in the dramatic ways some theories suggest. But beyond these basic probabilities, we enter the realm of speculation. Was he Aaron Kosminski, slowly descending into madness in his family's home? Was he Jacob Levy, driven to violence by syphilitic dementia? Was he some unknown sailor or butcher or doctor whose name never made it into the official files? Or was he someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, that he disappeared back into the anonymous masses of Victorian London without leaving a trace? The truth is, we may never know. The physical evidence has long since deteriorated or disappeared. The witnesses are dead. The official files are incomplete and contradictory. What we have instead is this rich tapestry of theories and suspects, each revealing as much about the theorist as about the potential killer. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Jack the Ripper case is about the nature of evil itself. We want our monsters to be obvious, to stand out from ordinary humanity in ways that make them easy to identify and avoid. But the reality is that most killers are depressingly normal people who commit extraordinary acts of violence. They're not the Hannibal Lecters of popular fiction, brilliant and charismatic psychopaths who taunt their pursuers. They're more often damaged, inadequate individuals who turn their rage against those weaker than themselves. The Jack the Ripper case endures because it represents one of our worst fears: that evil can emerge from anywhere, strike without warning, and then vanish back into the crowd. It reminds us that despite all our advances in forensic science and criminal psychology, despite our surveillance cameras and DNA databases, there are still crimes that resist solution and mysteries that remain unsolved. But there's something oddly comforting about that as well. In an age where we're told that everything can be quantified, analyzed, and explained, the Jack the Ripper case stands as a reminder that some things remain beyond our understanding. It preserves a sense of mystery in a world that sometimes seems to have explained everything away. The 5 women who died in Whitechapel in 1888, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, deserve to be remembered for more than just their role as victims in a famous unsolved case. They were human beings with their own stories, struggles, and dreams, who happened to encounter evil in the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to their memory is not solving the case that made them famous, but remembering that every unsolved murder represents not just a puzzle for investigators, but a life cut short and a family left without answers. In our fascination with Jack the Ripper, we should never forget that real people suffered and died, and that their stories matter more than any theory about who killed them. The Ripper files may never be closed, but they continue to teach us about justice, about society, and about the eternal human struggle between order and chaos, safety and danger, the known and the unknowable. In the end, perhaps that's the most important mystery of all. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through Victorian London's most enduring mystery. Remember, the shadows of history hold many secrets, and some are meant to remain in the darkness where they belong. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning the stories we tell ourselves about the past.